Hello and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews discussing a range of issues relevant to defence with UK practitioners at the top of their profession. I'm Andy Young and I work for the Military Sciences Research Group here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, I will host an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. This series is kindly supported by Airbus, a company that employs 12,500 people around the UK and contributes £7 billion to UK GDP. This month on A Call to Arms, we kick off our naval season with the Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Andrew Burns. The Surface Warfare Officer, Vice Admiral Burns has commanded everything from a mine countermeasures vessel to the US Navy's 5th Fleet Combined Task Force 50. Formerly Commander United Kingdom Strike Force, he is now responsible for the generation and operational effectiveness of the Royal Navy's 5 fighting arms. Vice Admiral, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Andy.
Before we go into some of the deeper questions, would it be possible for you to just give us an outline of the Fleet Commander role, the why, the what and the how of what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I'm responsible for the 4th generation of force elements for their operational tasking and employment, and then the oversight of those operations both around the UK and overseas. And I've recently taken full responsibility for the 4th generation element command headquarters. So that's a bit of a shift from the division of labour between the Fleet Commander and the Second Sea Lord that we've seen for a while. And with that, of course, goes the budgetary levers as well. I also have full command of those fighting arms that you mentioned. So the Fleet Air Arm, the Submarine Service, the Surface Flotilla, Royal Marines, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, acknowledging, of course, that this is a whole force effort. So it also involves our reserves and our excellent civil servants. And this is all now encapsulated in our Royal Naval strategy, maritime forces in support of a global Britain, and the First Sea Lord's vision, which is a global, ready, modern navy. And of course, what we need to be is as effective and as lethal as possible, acknowledging that the operating environment we're in now is in this era of persistent competition, and we need to modernise and adapt accordingly. And that really leads to a series of outputs. The first one is probably operational advantage in the North Atlantic and homeland defence. Sort of take those two together. Carrier strike, littoral strike, persistent engagement overseas. And I think the integrated review has set us up really nicely to deliver those 5 outputs, those 4 outputs really effectively. And that's what I'm responsible for generating the force elements to deliver. And what we do so effectively, I think, in the Royal Navy is aggregate and disaggregate those force elements for effect. And it's the combinations that we can develop over those fighting arms that really is so powerful, plus the reserves and the civil service. And I think we saw that really clearly during Operation FORTIS, our instinctive ability to aggregate and disaggregate and use maritime manoeuvre to have an effect over a broad geographical area with a number of partners and allies simultaneously, and then to aggregate again, to combine, to develop a really sort of convincing fighting force as and when you need it. And we now have really given meaning to that sort of global presence and that return to a global presence overseas, particularly in the Indo-Asia Pacific with 2 Batch 2 APVs deployed there, but also in the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and West Africa. And of course, we've still got our persistent presence in the Middle East with a frigate and or a destroyer, our MCMVs, and of course, the United Kingdom Maritime Component Commander alongside the 5th Fleet, recognising that command and control is a capability in and of itself, and that is an important thing to recognise. So there's some things that we have maintained and will endure, including, of course, the continuous at-sea deterrent now in its 53rd year. I think also the integrated review has set us up well to develop this persistent presence overseas and extend it through our littoral response groups, whether that's pulsing north from the UK or whether it's the littoral response group in the south, probably from the Middle East, pulsing into the Indo-Asia Pacific region from time to time. Backed up, of course, with periodic carrier strike group deployments and our batch 2 APVs overseas, all in support of HMG objectives, global Britain, supporting prosperity, engaging with allies, upholding the rules-based international system, and providing deterrent capability all over the world with our partners and allies. So I mentioned C2. I think we need to recognise C2 as a capability alongside all those outputs and the fighting arms, because without that, you're not able to knit it all together and have the effect and the output that you really want. And that includes having the right people, processes, technology, and structures in place to do that. And for day-to-day operations under my command, we have the Maritime Operations Centre in Northwood, who under a component model, with PGHQ being the global component commander with the Chief of Joint Operations, they really act as the global maritime component commander. And we're investing in a new warfighting centre in Portsmouth, which will bring together all the expertise, which will make us as adaptive as I think we need to be as our operating environment changes rapidly around us. So that will bring together in one centre that expertise so we can respond accordingly. The IR has given us a 4-year settlement, a bit of stability, that's hugely welcome. And alongside the second Sea Lord, I intend to drive this agenda forward in support of that first Sea Lord vision of being a global, modern and ready Navy.
That's really comprehensive. And if I can reflect on my own and our own knowledge of previous, I think it's a really ambitious place for the Navy to be in terms of we've had 2 decades of contraction post 1997 for obvious reasons. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan took up all the bandwidth. So this is really very ambitious in terms of you've recapitalized carrier strike capability, having lost it a decade ago. But what I found really interesting in that is you talking about the whole force effort, and that is really about people. So when and quite rightly talking about the civil service and the reserves, but there was a big drive under the former First Sea Lord to generate those further seagoing personnel. How are the new workforce models, the dual crewing, the watch rotations, really improving both the operational effectiveness and the lived experience of our personnel? Because without those personnel, you're not going to achieve that effect.
Yeah, I mean, just touching on your point about the whole force approach, I think we've talked about an enterprise approach for a long time, but we've never really given it meaning and brought it to life. And of course, we've got some industry partners with us today, and I include them in this sort of whole force approach as well, really, and really giving meaning to the enterprise, and they're an important part of it too. But to your specific question about the workforce, we kicked off a review in February last year, which was really about rebalancing towards seagoing units and our operational based defence planning assumptions. What does the workforce for today need to look like to deliver against those defence planning assumptions, and have we really got that right? What is our sort of recognised workforce picture? And we have, of course, had some really good examples of flexible crewing in the past that we've been able to adapt and test as we've taken some of the ideas from that review forward. But this is really about being more operationally effective, being more available, sustaining our forces better through that rebalancing, but particularly to really change the lived experience for our people who really crave a bit of stability. And we're asking ourselves the question: how do we deliver that? Now, for the surface flotilla, as I mentioned, we were in a relatively strong place to take some of those ideas forward. So our forward deployed batch 2 APVs are already dual crewed. Our hydrographic survey ships operated a 3-horse system, so we had some experience and lessons from those examples. We've now had Montrose in the Gulf forward deployed with a watch rotation system for 2 years. We've learned a huge amount from that experience, and that's going really, really well, and particularly with no diminution of our operational effectiveness and output. That's really important to know. And our MCMVs in the Gulf have already also operated a watch rotation system. So quite a lot of the Navy is already adopting a flexible crewing model, and it's a popular one as well. So most of the individuals who serve in those ships with those sort of crewing models are volunteers. So that in itself tells you that there's some benefit, and it's sort of working towards the aims that I've just set out. And it is all about trying to create a bit more stability in our programs so that our people can plan their lives accordingly. And it's recognizing the support we get from their families as well, and giving them some of the stability they crave too. So the 3-watch system is very effective in doing that. COVID-19 has, of course, had an impact. We've had to shorten those off-watch times, off-watch periods where you have to have a bit of leave, a bit of training, get ready for the next watch rotation, but that will begin to settle down. We'll be able to adapt to more sort of steady state posture. And the important thing is we learn from that experience, and then we introduce that into the models that we might adopt in the future. So what we're now doing is, on the basis of all that learning and evidence through those various systems of models, looking ahead to what our workforce requirement might be in 2035 with new classes of ship in service, Type 26, Type 31. How do we best employ the evidence from that experience into our crewing models for the future? So from the outset, we create that stability and a different type of lived experience. We've also done some trials in a Type 45 HMS Dragon and a Type 23 frigate HMS Portland. And we've sort of adopted a sort of core team of 130. And then the experiment here is really to generate some combat teams for the more complex operations that unit might have to undertake. And I was on board Portland for our final inspection just to see for myself how that was working. And I probably spoke to almost every member of the ship's company that day, and they were very positive about the effect that this is having, including the commanding officer. It's actually quite like having a flight or a Royal Marines boarding team that you put on board a ship for a specific type of operation. They're integrated, and then you can go off and confident you can deliver the outputs and effects that you're asked to have. I think also it's probably just worth saying that we've made some policy changes as well. So if you went around the dockyard over the Christmas period, as I did, you will notice that there were some ships that were locked up and were dormant. And that again allows people the ability to plan their lives more effectively. It's a perfectly reasonable way to manage our fleet when it's alongside. And it just allows a bit more freedom to take leave, do the right training. And again, it allows our people a bit more flexibility. I think there's some innovation required as well. So the digital endeavour that we're trying to put in place, I think will change the way we do store support, the way we do our human resources support. And I think there are opportunities in all of that as well.
That's really interesting to see how the lessons are being taken from the smaller ships which have had those, or the minor war vessels, which have had those different watch routines, crewing systems, and are being extrapolated back out. Are there any of the lessons that are seeing you having to test and adjust in order to make that work? Because of course you can't just replicate what happens in one ship. It's actually got to be relevant to the others. Are there any things that you are actually having to go, well, no, this isn't quite achieving the effect that we want?
I mean, I think that a couple of areas that we need to sort of finesse. I think one is the support of our forward deployed vessels and making sure that if we are to get better sustainability and availability out of their platform through a different crewing model, we need to have the right support for those platforms wherever they are overseas, and the facilities need to be in place. The global support organisation needs to get the stores in the right place at the right time. So that's fine for a ship like Montrose in the Gulf with a pretty mature architecture around it for that sort of activity. It's a bit more challenging for a Batch 2 APV, which will perhaps manoeuvre across a number of regions during the course of several watch rotations. But our decision was to get those batch 2 OPVs deployed, and let's test and adjust through experience. And we're learning an awful lot about how we do that. But generally, it's working well. We've had high availability and we've had extraordinary output from those vessels. They're achieving a huge amount.
And it's interesting
just before you go, I suppose the other thing would be training and synthetic training, and the opportunity that synthetic training offers. And I think we intend to invest heavily in synthetic training. The synthetic live balance really has to shift towards synthetic training, and I think there are sort of second and third order consequences from that, which allow a bit more stability for our workforce. I think it certainly allows more cutting edge training against the most testing and demanding scenarios for those combat teams. So these things are all linked, and it will enable our ships to be more sustainable and more available, because they won't need to be at sea perhaps for training purposes. You can do quite a lot of that either alongside or in the synthetic training environment. That's
really interesting from my perspective as a education officer previously, because, and having spoken to Air Vice Marshal Turner the other week, and we were talking about that 80-20% mix synthetic live, and of course there are things that you can only do live, and it's about maintaining the felicity of that in training and education. But that will free up things, which, I mean, you see the harbour training ships, for example, and the impact that has had, the positive impact those have had. Of course, there's no such thing as actually, nothing prepares you for the prospect of being at sea other than like being at sea. And so thinking about that, and thinking, as we said earlier, about the regeneration of the carrier strike group, I mean, Op FORTIS has been the signature deployment for the Royal Navy for so many reasons. What has been the biggest learning points or takeaways from your perspective from that planning and generation process, and what will you seek to exploit in the future?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been quite remarkable to see what the first carrier strike group deployment has achieved during Op FORTIS, and I think if you had shown us what the carrier group was going to achieve over the course of that deployment, we would have said that was wildly ambitious. And I think our partners and allies have been hugely impressed with what has been achieved. And you know, the Queen Elizabeth returned just before Christmas, and now the second carrier, the Prince of Wales, with a NATO badge on one of the islands, it is now at sea. And you know, is racing around off Portsmouth at 28 knots. So the fact we've returned to carrier strike capability after a gap of 10 years, and I think the pace at which we have achieved it has been quite remarkable, and a testament to the endeavours of all those who have been involved, from build through trials and all the way to delivering that first deployment on Op FORTIS. But for me, I think it's the statement that this makes about the Royal Navy as the premier navy in Europe, having two carriers with an F-35B strike package on board, fifth generation aircraft with a fifth generation carrier. That is a significant step change in capability. It's also about, I think, the way we operate our carrier groups, the flexibility that's inherent in that carrier group. And it was largely a sovereign carrier group on this occasion because we wanted to test our ability to deliver that. But of course, we have partners and allies moving in and out of the task group. And that, again, I think hints at this level of flexibility that a task group can deliver. But it's also about this aggregation and disaggregation. So simultaneously, you can be conducting warfighting training at sea, a unit can be delivering defence engagement in one area or some key leadership engagement in another. And then you can bring back that mass to be a really credible fighting package. So I think that instinctive aggregation and disaggregation to have an effect over a wide geographical area is really significant. And it's something that I think we do particularly well in the Royal Navy. In terms of the sort of planning, I think we've learned to be comfortable with uncertainty. And without being too rigid, we recognise that as an instrument of state, you might need to adapt your plan to give the government and give ministers options, but also be ready to respond to events, disaster relief or a crisis or, nefarious activity in international waters off Crimea or in the South China Sea. And it's really exercising mission command, allowing the commander within a clear framework to adjust the plan accordingly. And I think what's been really heartening is the degree of coherence, both sort of horizontally and vertically. So from the Carrier Strike Group headquarters all the way up to the Cabinet Office and horizontally with partners and allies as the deployment has unfolded. So it's that sort of flexibility, mission command, and that has really been brought to bear during this last deployment. It's also having a sort of longer term perspective, and we're trying to have at least a 5-year perspective on our scheduling without being rigid about it. But if you can signal those opportunities over the longer term, I think you enable allies to bind themselves into your planning at an earlier stage. You also allow partners across government to participate in whatever you have planned at an earlier stage, wrap them in from a sort of multi-domain integration perspective, which I think is important. And then again, you present, really credible cross-government options to ministers by doing that. So I think that's been a lesson as well. And I think quite deliberately, we have had quite a sort of procedural approach to the fourth generation of this carrier group. I'm not sure we're going to have a similar approach next time. I think there's quite a lot of activity that can be delivered in parallel. That will drive some efficiencies. That will drive up the availability of those carrier groups. So I think that's one of the things we've learned as well. We've learned how to integrate a 5th generation aircraft. We've learned about the convening power of those carriers, and our allies and partners have been hugely supportive. The interchangeability agenda has really been borne out of our experience. So the fact that we had our F-35 jets refueling from US aircraft from the Carl Vinson Group, recovering to another carrier and then returning after a follow-on sortie back to our carrier, that is genuine interchangeability. It's not just interoperability. So our ability to drive that agenda forward, I think, has been really exciting during Fortis and will be in the future as well. The simulators we've had on board, we had 2 F-35B simulators in the carrier. Again, we've seen availability and I think the proficiency of our aircrew, not just maintained, but enhanced. And the efficiency you can drive through mission rehearsal by having those simulators on board has been hugely powerful as well. So if you look at some of the statistics, which I think sum up that deployment and the planning and 4th generation effort that went into it, 18 named exercises and operations. I think something like 64 or 34 different aircraft types from 17 nations operating on board, nearly 5,000 flying hours. We've exercised with 23 nations. We've had 66 foreign ministers visit the carrier group and over 100 ambassadors. Those sort of statistics for me really sum up the influence that carrier group has been able to deliver, not just from a military perspective, not just from a hard power perspective, but very much from a soft power perspective as well. And those combinations, I think, are hugely important. In terms of sort of looking forward, I think we now have to embed the power of our carrier groups and what they can offer for the nation. We need to embed that in the thinking of defence so that we absolutely get the most out of them. And, we are offering some opportunities over the next couple of years where we hadn't perhaps spotted them before, and now we've learned so much from Op FORTIS to really exploit the availability of both the Prince of Wales and the Queen Elizabeth.
Hearing you speak there and talk through it and look at those wider functions, and I can't help but think about Corbett and the functions of the fleet being to engage in diplomacy or constrain your opponents, to protect or constrain trade, and then finally that war fighting function to project power ashore to support your military effort. And really, I suppose Fortis has kind of captured all of that in a big statement way, but almost transitory in the Indo-Pacific. Whereas now, of course, you've got other assets out there which can certainly act in that diplomatic and trade function. So particularly with the basing of HMS Tamar and Spey, those two OPVs, how does that deployment fit into the wider engage and constrain functions envisaged under IOPC, the integrated operating concept?
Yeah, and it's 64 aircraft types, by the way. Well, I think what Fortis has demonstrated is still the enduring power and influence that the White Ensign flying from Royal Naval warships has all around the world, particularly for defence engagement opportunities. And I think that is absolutely in tune with the integrated operating concept. And then if you look at the sort of layering of our forward deployed activity, batch to APVs providing persistent presence, a regular pulsing of a carrier group to whichever part of the world we decide to send it to, plus our littoral response groups, north and south, an enduring presence in the Middle East. That's pretty impressive global coverage. I think we need to think carefully about which partners and allies we want to prioritise. The network of our defence attachés and liaison officers in the command and control nodes in the regions that we think are most important for the country. We need to develop that network to support that forward deployed footprint. And we're certainly doing that. But what we've been able to do is engage more regularly, we will be able to engage more regularly with our regional partners. It'll allow ministerial engagement using a Royal Naval platform with a White Ensign flying to serve their purposes. And we can then exploit the sort of media opportunities to reinforce some of the messages and amplify our commitment to whichever part of the world it is, whether that's the Indo-Asia Pacific, the North Atlantic, or wherever. And so Tamar and Spey in the Indo-Asia Pacific region are a real visible commitment to the Indo-Asia Pacific tilt as described in the integrated review. I visited Trent in Senegal a couple of months ago to see what she was achieving in terms of binding together the various agencies that are looking at maritime domain awareness in that particular region, trying to tackle nefarious activity, criminal activity at sea, which also has a military dimension to it. Ashore, these things are directly connected. Remarkable work there. Really useful work previously off Ukraine in training the Ukrainian Navy. But those vessels are able to integrate with the indigenous forces and agencies of whichever country or region they're in. And we've seen that in a number of ways. Develop some interoperability with those partners and allies. Uphold the rules-based international system wherever that is. These are quite powerful statements of intent wherever you're able to position those ships. And so those platforms are absolutely able to deliver against HMG priorities in the region, support the Global Britain agenda. They can be flexible, they can integrate, but they can also embark other capabilities. So you can have let's say, Royal Marine short-term training team ashore, which you can rotate through and provide an enduring presence. And then you send a batch to OPV with a Royal Marines boarding team on board, which can have an effect at sea, but also link up with your STTT ashore. So again, going back to the start and the power of some of those combinations across the fighting arms is what really delivers meaningful effect. And I think what the Royal Marines offer as well is a cultural awareness that other formations perhaps don't have. And certainly the reporting I got back from the Senegalese was really positive about the approach the Royal Marines adopt to the training that they're able to deliver. And then, of course, you can link up these force elements within a task group. and that doesn't necessarily have to be led by the UK, but carrier strike group or a littoral strike group. So again, it gives you options and combinations depending on the effect and the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve.
Thank you so much. I think we've got there a really in-depth perspective of something that Richard Harding described as the vision of success, the structures to achieve it, and then finally the lived experience that underpins it. And I think as we see all of these things coming together, it places the Royal Navy in a very exciting position, one certainly that I'm very envious of now sat on this side of the desk. For yourself, just thinking about that vision of success, when you leave this role in however many years' time, or months' time, sorry, sort of 2 years' time, what will you look back at and want to go, yes, that was the moment for me?
I mean, I think it's, short of a crisis where we have to respond, which we really hope doesn't happen, but those are the things you will tend to remember. I think it's likely to be the sort of giving real meaning to this global footprint. Returning to persistent presence in parts of the world where we have strategic interests, returning to an era where the Navy is recognised as a true instrument of deterrence and diplomacy. And I think the conditions are absolutely right to do that, and that is why it really is such an exciting time to be the fleet commander. So I think all the things I've described are really beginning to mature, and if we're able to mature those over the next 3 years, and at the same time develop an adaptive culture so that we recognise how rapidly technology is changing, how the operating environment is changing. And we have a culture which recognises that perhaps we need to give up some things that are less relevant today, and we adopt technology that's more relevant for the future. If I leave this post having established that sort of culture and that sort of adaptive mindset, I'll be really pleased.
Vice Admiral Burns, I'm going to leave it there because that's a bombshell to drop on. And that's certainly a head mark to aim for. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for that absolutely fascinating view, as always, of what is going on at the coalface within the Royal Navy. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Andy. Pleasure.
A Call to Arms is part of the Military Sciences Profession of Arms programme. The show is produced by Peppy Van Arnen and Chris Jones and is sponsored by Airbus. If you enjoyed the show, please rate it and leave a review. Your feedback helps us tailor future interviews to what you, our audience, want to know. RUSI is a membership organisation, and it is thanks to our members and sponsors that we are able to maintain our independence, challenge orthodoxy, and deliver groundbreaking thought leadership. If you consider yourself to be connected to the profession of arms, then perhaps membership is for you. You can find more information at rusi.org/membership. For less than the price of a good cocktail each month, you can join a growing global community with exclusive access to events, research, and insights that put you ahead of your peers. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to welcoming you back next month for more from A Call to Arms.